In the early 1980s, biologists counting grizzly bears across the mountains of northwestern Montana came back with a number that read like a death sentence. 386. That was every grizzly left in the entire Northern Continental Divide, the wild spine of country running from Glacier National Park south toward Helena and Missoula. 100 years earlier, these mountains had held thousands. Now, there were 386, scattered and shrinking, and most of the people who understood the data assumed they were watching the last act. That was the early 1980s. By 2024, there were more than 1,000, and the land those bears walked had begun to change in ways almost nobody saw coming. If you had stood in a Montana ranch town in 1982 and asked anyone about the future of the grizzly, you would have heard the same answer. It was over. The great bear of the American West was becoming a memory, the way the bison had nearly become a memory a century before. They had no idea what was actually coming. To understand how close the edge really was, you have to look at what had already been lost. Before settlers pushed west, something close to 50,000 grizzly bears ranged across the lower 48 states. They moved from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains, from the high north down into Mexico. The journals of Lewis and Clark describe them filling the river country of Montana, unbothered and everywhere. Then came the rifles, the traps, the poisoned carcasses, and the slow erasure of the open land the bears needed to survive. By the 1930s, the grizzly's range in the lower 48 had collapsed to roughly 2% of what it had been. 50,000 animals became a few hundred, pressed into the high country around Glacier and Yellowstone, holding on in the only places remote enough to ignore them. In 1975, with fewer than 800 grizzlies left across the entire lower 48, the federal government listed the species as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. On paper, it was protection. In practice, nobody knew if protection had come in time. A population that small, spread that thin, can vanish from bad luck alone. A few hard winters, a run of conflicts with ranchers, a stretch of failed births, and the math simply runs out. This is the part that seemed small at the time, but was not. The listing did not just stop the killing. It triggered a slow, unglamorous machine of recovery that would run for the next 40 years. In 1982, federal biologists approved a national grizzly bear recovery plan, dividing the bear's last strongholds into recovery ecosystems with population targets attached. A year later, in 1983, an interagency committee was formed to coordinate the whole effort across state lines, agency lines, and the long memory of public resentment. None of it was dramatic. There was no single rescue, no famous release caught on film. There was paperwork, radio collars, road closures, garbage management, and decades of patient counting. And in one corner of Montana, there was a gamble. By the early 1990s, the grizzlies in the Cabinet Mountains near the Idaho border had dwindled so far that the population was effectively a handful of bears with no genetic future. So between 1990 and 1994, biologists captured 4 young female grizzlies in British Columbia and trucked them south into the cabinets, hoping new blood would keep the line alive. 4 bears to rebuild a population, which, looking back, was either remarkably bold or completely unreasonable, depending on which year you asked. It worked, not overnight and not cleanly, but it worked. And there is a reason this story is still studied today, because what happened next went far beyond the survival of a single mountain range. The Northern Continental Divide population, the largest grizzly stronghold left south of Canada, did not just stabilize, it grew. The 386 bears of the early 1980s became well over 1,000. That is not a rounding error or an optimistic projection. That is a verified on-the-ground count, and it represents one of the most complete large carnivore recoveries in American history. Then the bears did something the recovery plans had barely accounted for. They started to leave the mountains. For decades, grizzlies had been boxed into the high country, the last refuges where humans tolerated them. As the population filled those refuges, young bears went looking for room. In the Northern Continental Divide, occupied grizzly range expanded by roughly 2,500 square miles in just a couple of years, a gain of about 12%. Today, there are more than 24,000 square miles of occupied grizzly range in that ecosystem alone, and across all of their recovery zones in the lower 48, grizzlies now move through something like 59,000 square miles of country. Numbers like that are easy to skim past, so sit with one detail. Bears began appearing on the Rocky Mountain front and then beyond it, following the Marias, the Teton, and the Sun River drainages more than 60 miles out onto the plains. Montana's own bear managers described watching grizzlies move into country where the species had not been seen in years. A bear turned up near Big Sandy in north-central Montana, the farthest east a grizzly had ever been confirmed in that region. Another was caught on a game camera out on the open prairie of the Upper Missouri River Breaks, the first grizzly documented in that landscape in roughly 100 years. That last one is not a typo. 100 years. An animal that had been erased from the plains was walking back onto them, on its own, following the same river country its ancestors had ruled when Lewis and Clark came through. A male grizzly can range across 600 to 1,000 square miles and cover 20 to 40 miles in a single day. So when a population stops shrinking and starts growing, it does not expand politely. It floods outward along every river and ridgeline it can find, and everywhere it goes, it brings something with it. Not just teeth and territory. A job. A function the land had been missing for a century. If you are getting something out of this, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into the real science behind America's wildlife comebacks, one story at a time, and there is a lot more of this country's wild history to uncover. While all of this counting and mapping was happening, a separate question was quietly being answered in the field. Not how many bears there were, what the bears were doing to the country around them. The clearest answers came from Yellowstone, the most heavily studied wild ecosystem on the continent, where researchers could watch grizzlies, wolves, and elk interact across decades. What they found reframed the entire idea of what a grizzly is. A grizzly is not just a large animal that lives in a wilderness. It is one of the forces that builds the wilderness. Start with the elk. For most of the 20th century, with the big predators gone, elk herds had grown dense and comfortable. They lingered. They grazed the same stream banks and aspen stands down to nothing, year after year, and the young trees and berry shrubs never got a chance to recover. Then, the predators came back. Wolves returned to Yellowstone in the mid-1990s, but they were never alone in the work. Grizzly bears, black bears, cougars, and human hunters all pressed on the same elk herds at once, and the effect on the youngest elk was dramatic. Studies tracking radio-collared elk calves found that the share killed by grizzly and black bears climbed from about 23% in the late 1980s to as much as 60% 2 decades later. In the same window, the northern Yellowstone elk herd fell from nearly 20,000 animals to around 8,000. Fewer elk, kept constantly moving by predators, meant the stream banks finally got a rest. Willows, aspens, and berry-producing shrubs began to return, and the timing of that recovery, lining up almost exactly with the return of a full predator community, was nearly too clean to be coincidence. Recovery came back on a schedule the scientists could see. Here is where it loops back on itself in a way that surprised even the scientists. Those recovering berry shrubs feed the grizzlies. One study was the first to show that wolves, by helping thin and redistribute the elk, indirectly handed the bears a richer food supply. As one wildlife researcher put it, wolves support a more resilient grizzly population, partly because the carcasses they leave behind become food the bears scavenge through the lean months. The predators were not competing the bears out of existence. In a strange, looping way, they were holding the door open for each other. But this stopped being a story about any single animal a long time ago. The grizzly's real influence runs deeper than predation, down into the soil itself. Spend a season watching a grizzly, and you realize it spends an enormous amount of time digging. Tearing up ground for roots and bulbs, excavating ground squirrels, turning over rocky alpine soil in search of anything edible. That digging is not incidental. It churns and aerates the soil, mixes nutrients, and increases the availability of nitrogen in high country ecosystems that are otherwise slow and stingy with it. Ecologists sometimes call bears forest farmers for exactly this reason. They are not gardening on purpose. But the effect of all that foraging is that they open the ground and create the conditions for new growth to take root. Then there are the seeds. Grizzlies eat huge volumes of fruit and berries, and the seeds pass through them intact and get deposited miles away in fresh soil, complete with fertilizer. A single bear ranging across hundreds of square miles becomes a moving engine of plant dispersal, carrying the next generation of berry shrubs out across the landscape and planting them as it goes. The same animal that eats the berries is the one that spreads them. And here is the detail almost everyone misses. In Yellowstone, as native cutthroat trout declined, grizzlies shifted more of their spring hunting onto elk calves, and that single diet change rippled through elk recruitment and population growth. Pull one thread, the trout, and it moves the bears, which moves the elk, which moves the vegetation. The grizzly sits at the center of a web where almost nothing it does stays local. Predator, gardener, soil engineer, seed carrier, remove it and the whole system slackens. Return it and the system tightens back up. That is what the recovery actually bought, not just more bears on a map. A keystone put back into an arch that had been sagging for a century. But none of this is settled, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The science itself is still argued over. The popular version of the Yellowstone story says wolves alone reshaped the land by frightening elk into changing their behavior, the so-called landscape of fear. A number of researchers think people had the full picture wrong. Their analysis suggests it was not fear of wolves that gave the vegetation a chance. It was raw predation from a whole guild of hunters, including human ones, that simply reduced elk numbers enough for the plants to come back. There is little evidence, they argue, that wolves changed elk behavior dramatically enough to regrow a forest on their own. It is a reminder that even celebrated ecology stories get revised as the data deepens. And then there is the fight over the bear's future. A grizzly population that has climbed past 1,000 is, by the original recovery targets, a success. Politicians, including Montana's senior senator, argue the bears have recovered and should be removed from the endangered species list, handed back to state management. Conservation groups counter that delisting would open the door to trophy hunting on a population still recovering, and they point to a hard number from 2025 when at least 72 grizzlies died in the greater Yellowstone region and surrounding areas, tying the highest annual death toll ever recorded. The recent 2-year stretch ran roughly 35% above the 10-year average of 54 deaths a year. The clock on this is real. Federal wildlife officials face a deadline of December 2026 to decide whether to keep, revise, or revoke the grizzly's protected status, and whatever they choose will shape the next several decades. What does not get argued about is what happens on the ground when people decide to make room. On the Rocky Mountain front, ranchers, conservation groups, and federal agencies have permanently protected more than 220,000 acres of wildlife habitat, much of it funded by tens of millions of dollars in private conservation money. Some of the families ranching that country have worked it for generations, and a few of them describe living alongside the bears with something close to acceptance. When the grizzlies are out there and not causing trouble, one third-generation rancher said, "It is good to have them around." If the recovery had stopped at simply not killing the last few hundred bears, this would be a very different story. Instead, people chose to give the animal back its country, which brings it back to that number, 386. The count that once looked like an ending, written down by biologists who could not have known what they were actually measuring. They thought they were recording a disappearance. They were recording a floor. From that floor, 1,000 bears climbed back up and walked out across 24,000 square miles of mountain and plain, digging the soil, scattering the seeds, moving the elk, and quietly rebuilding a wilderness that the people who counted them in 1982 had already given up for dead. The bear that everyone assumed they were saying goodbye to turned out to be the one thing the land could not heal without.